We have a special guest with us as we get ready for this 1884 presidential election. We invited the Democratic candidate Grover Cleveland, the Republican James Blaine. They were otherwise occupied, but we do have somebody here special for us. The very first woman who's running for president of the presidency of these great 38 United States. Would you welcome Belva Lockwood?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Delighted to be with you this evening. I cannot vote, but I can be voted for. Let me say that again. I cannot vote, but I can be voted for. So you gentlemen here today, you can and should vote for me as the best candidate for the social and economic welfare of our great country. And ladies, encourage your husbands to go to the polls. Do what is right and fair and in the interest of all citizens. Women before me, accept that as your role until such time as you yourselves are able to use the elective franchise. Something that we hope and pray is not far off ourselves. Something so well reflected in this song, sung just last year for the first time at the National Women's Suffrage Association meeting in Washington, D.C. Our country now from thee claim we our liberty in freedom's name. Guarding homes, altar fires, daughters of patriot sires, their zeal our own inspires justice to claim. Women in every age for this great heritage tribute have paid. Our birthright claim we now, longer refuse to bow. On freedom's altar now our hand is laid. Sons, will you longer see mothers on bended knee for justice pray? Rise now in manhood's might to speed the dawning light. With earth's true souls unite on freedom's day. Our garnered sheaves we yield, gleaned from each glorious field women have wrought. True standard raising high, ready to do and die, enriching life for aye with deed and thought. Grateful for freedom won, to work so well begun, patriots by thee. And it shall never be until from sea to sea chorused the song shall be, women are free. The National Women's Suffrage Association just last year met and sang that new song, a song that embodies the hopes of all that we are looking for. But let me return to myself. even at an early age, I had a firm belief in my own worth and powers. I never for a moment stopped to consider whether a particular labor was such as something that a woman would do or that women were accustomed to do, but only whether I had the ability to perform it. Of course, with this tendency in mind, I was constantly running into difficulties. At about 10 years of age, I read the Bible through, but I read it as a child reads it, believing literally all that it contains. I supposed that faith only was necessary to attain the miracles of Scripture. Believing that I might have this faith with a proper disposition of mind, I undertook to perform these miracles. And I, of course, ingloriously failed. My efforts at walking on water resulted in a sad wetting of my pantalettes and a severe scolding from my mother. My next effort was to raise the dead. And for this purpose, I selected a neighboring burying ground and the grave of a child from a neighbor who had recently been interred. But the grave did not open, and the dead did not rise and come forth as in the case of Lazarus, and my self-esteem received another severe shock. But I attributed these failures to a want of either sufficient understanding or sufficient concentration, and still supposed that I should someday be able to accomplish these miracles. Determined to succeed, I selected a small hill and concentrated all my willpower upon it. But the hill did not move. I may not have raised the dead as a child, but I can stand before you today, a presidential candidate in the 1884 election, and I can say with confidence that although I did not raise the dead, I have certainly awakened the living. As the Equal Rights Party candidate, I promise to promote and maintain equal political privileges in every class of citizens, irrespective of sex, color, nationality, in order to make America in truth what it has so long been in name, the land of the free and the home of the brave. If elected, I shall recommend in my inaugural speech a uniform system of laws as far as practical for all the states, and especially for marriage and divorce, and the law of distribution of estates that will make the wife equal with the husband in authority and right, and an equal partner in the common business. I am committed to protecting and fostering American industries by achieving a fair balance between tariffs and free trade that will serve the working men and women of this country. I will also urge the extension of commercial relations with foreign countries and work to establish a high court of arbitration to which commercial and political differences can be referred, putting an end to the horrors of war. I support citizenship for Native Americans. I fully support temperance. My esteemed opponents, Democrat Grover Cleveland and Republican James Blaine, well, they don't dare take a stance on any of these issues, but rather spend their time in taunts and rebuttals against one another. Wouldn't you rather elect a president who stands for something, who will get things done? But before we go any further, let me tell you about myself so that you may understand the road that has led me here today, standing before you in 1884. I was born Belva Ann Bennett in Royalton, New York on October 24th, 1830. My parents, Louis and Hannah Green Bennett, they were hardworking farmers, eking out a living in the northwestern corner of New York, territory that had only opened up at the beginning of the century. I was the second of five, 4 girls and a boy. Farming is hard work. And my father relied on all of us to labor. And yet, even then, I experienced what it was to be female, as I perceived that my labors had less value because I was a girl and then a woman. My father did not encourage me in my studies, and yet he was glad enough for me to be so successful in those studies that I was offered a teaching position, which added to the family coffers. It was while I was teaching that I came face to face with the first of many instances where women were not treated equally to men. As a female instructor, I received half the pay that a male teacher received. With the exact same responsibilities, I still received half of the pay that a male teacher receives for no other reason than my misfortune of being a woman. The experience of employment set my imagination to working. And I began to think of leading a life different from my mother and my aunts, a life only enjoyed up until that point by men. I asked permission to return to school, but my father denied my request. He did not value education for women and declined it. What was there then for me to do? Except follow the trodden path of womanhood. I married, and I married well. My husband, Uriah McNall, was the son of a prosperous man in the area. We settled down to farming, and Uriah ran a small sawmill. When I think back on it, it seems ironic that while I was leaving my dreams of independence behind, that same year, 1848, 68 women, including well-known suffragists Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were meeting for the first time. And in that meeting, they set down the declaration of sentiments and resolutions that outlined the emerging women's rights movement and what they wanted to accomplish. I want to share just a little bit of that with you. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it and to insist upon the institution of a new government. Such has been the patient sufferance of the women under this government, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to demand the equal station to which they are entitled. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. He has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. And so this document goes on, the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. This historic document was being drafted just 100 miles away from where I was taking up the yoke of domestic toil as the only avenue open to me. Women organizing themselves and acting independently was a new concept at that time and went against society's opinion of a woman's place. A lady's advice booklet published that exact same year, 1848, advised women on their proper behavior, because a woman's reputation and behavior and appearance were all she had to trade upon to get her by in life. According to this booklet, a lady's behavior in the street should be modest, dignified, yet pleasant and engaging. A lady should never walk with a wriggle or sway from side to side or stare. A lady is not permitted upon any ordinary occasion from taking the arm of any but a male relative or an accepted suitor. A question from a stranger beyond the most basic and necessary of questions should be considered a gross insult and repelled with spirit. This was the world into which I came of age. Had not my life taken a sharp turn, I might not be before you here today. Uriah, my husband of only 4 years, departed this life. I was left alone to fend for myself and our 3-year-old daughter, Laura. It took much subterfuge on my part to get my way when I declared that I would return to school. Among the naysayers were friends and family who said education for women. My father said education for women was immodest and irreligious and improper. Family and friends also said things like, what did I expect to make of myself, and other impertinent questions. But I was not as tractable at 22 as I had been at 18. I persisted and I completed the academic term. I then asked to teach the winter school in my neighborhood, but was promptly told by the trustees that they had already employed a male instructor. The winter term was considered the more important terms, and so often women were given the roles to instruct summer term. Well, the winter term was only half elapsed when those same trustees presented themselves before me and begged that I would take control of the school as they had dismissed their male instructor. This I did. I raised enough money to enroll at Genesee College, which was experimenting in coeducation. I left Laura with my parents while I pursued my goal, and I graduated with honors in 1857. Life at Genesee was not easy. The hours were long. Discussion between the sexes was discouraged. There was not any socializing to speak of. Occasionally, I slipped away to attend an evening lecture at a local law office, and it was there that I saw for the first time Susan B. Anthony speak. After graduation, I taught at the Lockport Union School in New York, once again, forced to accept a lower wage simply because of my gender. But I was able, after a time, to bring my youngest sister in Verno, as well as Laura, to Lockport to live with me. I was able to support us, and finally, I was independent. You could say that my early achievements were partly due to my own personality and drive, and partly to the changing role of women in civic life leading up to the middle of the century. 18th century women tended to hearth and home and had little to do with public life. By the time of my birth in 1830, though, female literacy was on the upswing, and many women were taking an active interest in social and political reform and in improving their communities as well. Albeit they were doing this in ways appropriate to a woman's station in society. I joined the Methodist movement as they were very progressive on their views towards a woman's role. In the 1850s, I came to know and respect Susan B. Anthony. We formed a warm relationship at that time over our common interest in female education. I have always believed that education is the key to improving women's standing in society. I've actually put forth the precept, radical to many I know, that a woman should be able to support herself before she thinks of entering into marriage. I worked at several schools in New York State whose principals did not share my views. One forbade me from taking the girls skating for exercise on the grounds that it was immodest and irreligious. What I really desired was a school of my own, where I could test out all the ideas and theories bubbling inside of me. And at length, I raised enough money to purchase such a school. I ran it for 3 years and sold it for twice what I paid for it. It was during this time, while I was teaching, that the Civil War broke out. War is distasteful to me under any circumstances. I was opposed to slavery, but I deplored the methods to which we were forced to resort for its eradication, the fearful cruelties and cost of war. I would have much preferred a peaceful arbitration to the sad carnage that followed. But no woman's advice was asked about the war. No woman voted a subsidy to maintain it. Though all over the land, north and south, women's hearts were wrung over the loss of loved ones that they were powerless to shield. A war raged without the consent of the persons who are called upon to maintain it is unjust and tyrannical. It is my belief that with the financial outlay necessary to conduct the war, the freedom of every slave could have been purchased. The field of education brought me much gratification, but still, I knew that I could do more with my life. And now that Laura was becoming a young woman, I decided it was time for me to try something completely new. I moved to Washington, D.C. In 1866, Washington wasn't a place for people to live, but rather to pass through while conducting business or while in office. It wasn't the fine city that Philadelphia or Boston is. It was dirty and transient. And at the close of the Civil War, it was seething with activity as the country moved to put the war behind it and to map out a future. It was exciting. I took a job at a young ladies' school. In this way, I could support myself. The limited hours of this position allowed me to look around. I often sat in the newly opened ladies' gallery in the Senate, and I also attended the Supreme Court chambers. It was a pleasure to watch the legal and political questions of the day unfold before me. It was there that I began to dream of a life far beyond teaching. Despite my family's pressure on me to join them in Illinois, I decided that Washington was where my future lay. I had always been interested in the Constitution, in law, and in political life. I noted that for many men, the path to greatness incorporated the study of law. And I also noted that the political sphere accorded many great opportunities. I made perhaps a rather bold move. I presented myself as a candidate to work in the consulate at Ghent. I studied the language and everything that I would need to know in order to be successful in this position. But if you can imagine, I never even heard a word back about my petition. Well, it might have been that I was a woman, or perhaps it was that President Andrew Johnson was shortly thereafter impeached and had other things to think about. After more than 15 years of widowhood, I married Ezekiel Lockwood. He was 30 years my senior, a man of high principle, and an advocate for women. I gave up the school and I began reading Blackstone's Commentaries, which was all about English law. When I was done with that, I moved on to Kent's Commentaries, which was all about American law. I could not quench my thirst for the subject. And after attending with Ezekiel the opening lecture of the brand new Columbian College Law School, I presented myself as a registrant, entrance fee in hand. My petition was presented to the college faculty, and I received a letter several weeks later telling me that I was not welcome at their institution, as I would prove a distraction to the young men students. Once again, the welfare and progress of women gave way to the wishes of men. The next year, the National University Law School opened, and wonder of wonders, women were invited to apply, which I did, along with 15 other women, many of whom I must confess I don't think they knew what they were signing themselves up for. Of those initial students, only myself and one other stayed the course to graduate. At first, we were allowed to attend the courses and lectures and such right along with the male students. But after a time, they put up quite a protest about our being there, and so we were told that we could no longer attend in person any of the courses, but we would study along. We continued with our studies into the end, and then at the point in time when we were ready to graduate, the male students put up such a fuss over sharing the graduation podium with females that we were not granted our degrees. In spite of this setback, I petitioned the bar of the DC Supreme Court for admission. I underwent a rigorous 3-day examination by a committee. But after that, they refused to take action. After a time, I presented myself along with my fee to Georgetown University, but I was declined. I attended some courses at Howard University. And in the meantime, I was already practicing, taking on cases and trying them before some of the more progressive judges. However, I was limited by my lack of a degree and admittance before the bar. Finally, in 1873, I was so desperate, I sent a letter to President Ulysses S. Grant, who was the ex officio president of the National University Law School. And I wrote, "Sir, you are or you are not the president of the National University Law School. If you are its president, I desire to say to you that I have passed through the curriculum of study in this school and am entitled to and demand my diploma. If you are not its president, I ask that you take your name from its papers and not hold out to be what you are not." I did not receive a direct response, but my degree arrived in short order. The District of Columbia Bar thus admitted me, although several judges said they had no confidence in me, a reaction I have experienced repeatedly. When I tried to gain admission to the Maryland Bar, a judge lectured me, that God himself had determined that women were not equal to men and never would be. When I tried to respond on my own behalf, he said I had no right to speak and had me removed from the court. Nonetheless, I already had cases lining up. Between the sympathy that I drew from some, the great confidence of many of my colleagues and friends, and the publicity that I had received throughout the process. Ironically, I didn't have to wait for cases, as many of those male students who had graduated with me were waiting for cases. My troubles were not over, though. When I sought to gain admission to the Court of Claims after the justices filed in, there was an uncomfortable pause, and then Justice Drake announced, "Mistress Lockwood, you are a woman." For the first time in my life, I began to realize that it was a crime to be a woman. I at once pled guilty to the charge. Nothing was resolved, and the case was continued to the following week, when the justice put forth a new accusation. "Mistress Lockwood, you are a married woman." That almost took my breath away, but I collected myself and responded with a wave of my hand toward my husband, saying, "Yes, may it please the court, but I am here with the consent of my husband." Well, it did not please the court, and the petition dragged on week after week, until at last the decision came down. The court said, "The position which this court assumes is that under the laws and Constitution of the United States, a court is without power to grant such an application, and that a woman is without legal capacity to take the office of attorney." Well, that dampened my sails, but I continued to do legal work and employed counsel to appear on my behalf whenever necessary, while I waited the 3 years necessary to apply to appear before the U.S. Supreme Court. A lawyer in good standing before any state's bar for a period of 3 years could be admitted to the Supreme Court bar. I read the wording very carefully. It didn't say male lawyer or man or anything that would preclude me. More fool was I. In response to my application to the Supreme Court bar, the court rendered the opinion, "As this court knows no English precedent for the admission of women to the bar, it declines to admit unless there be a more extended public opinion or special legislation." No English precedent? What about Victoria, Empress of India, or Queen Elizabeth I? If they wanted the question legislated, I was going to make sure they got it. After 2 bills written by men on my behalf failed to pass, I drafted one myself. By this time, many newspapers were interested in the affair and pledged to help me in whatever way they could. I got a sponsor to put the bill forth, and after a protracted, stressful period, when it could have gone either way, I resorted to meetings and lobbying and any other tactics to get them to vote. It was a success, and the bill admitting women to the bar of the United States Supreme Court was signed into law in February of 1879 by Rutherford B. Hayes. Shortly thereafter, I became the first woman to be admitted to the Supreme Court bar. This served to open opportunities for women to appear in federal and state courts throughout the land. Sadly, my husband Ezekiel didn't live to see it. He passed away 2 years before, leaving me once again a widow. but I know he would have been proud. For many years, I have supported myself and my family with legal work, such as pension claims brought by veterans, where I have made a difference in so many lives. So many veterans at the close of the war were not paid the money that was owed to them. And this went on for months and years. And I have represented many and gotten them what was due to them. I have made a difference. And yet I know there is a greater role that I can fill in bringing about equality and justice and fairness for all in this great nation. Receiving the nomination in August from the Equal Rights Party was directly in line with my aspiration to affect change in a wider sphere. As a candidate, I have received my share of ridicule, but that does not bother me, for I expect to be treated in like fashion, and all of the candidates are not above ridicule. However, I will say that the newspapers received my September 3rd letter of acceptance of the nomination with respect, one going so far as to say that if the letter had been available earlier, that the other candidates would have benefited by reading it for its pith and candor. Democrat Grover Cleveland and Republican James Blaine are, of course, the front-running candidates, though for years there has not been much to choose from between the parties when it comes to policy and philosophy. My Superior Court ally, Benjamin Butler, is running as a greenback, and John St. John is running with the Prohibition Party. We, the Equal Rights Party, support prohibition, but we have a broader agenda of social and political justice. As you might imagine, much is being made of my gender in this election. There are some that say that Victoria Woodhull was the first for president in 1872. However, she failed to meet the minimum age requirement and was not on any state ballots. But I will leave it to the history books to decide who truly was the first woman to run for president. I have received much correspondence at my residence on F Street in Washington, a 20-room building that houses my offices and my home, and some of rooms I also rent out to others. Some of the correspondence is congratulatory. Many want to know more about my views. Some are scornful that a woman should seek to undertake an unfeminine role in public life. One, though, amused me so greatly that I sent it along to the newspapers. A male admirer wrote, "O Belva Ann, fair Belva Ann, I know that thou art not a man, but I shall vote, pull off my coat, and work for thee, fair Belva Ann, for I have read what thou hast said, and long I've thought upon thy plan. Oh no, there's none beneath the sun who'd rule like thee, my Belva Ann." I've crisscrossed this nation, making campaign speeches like the one this evening, and I'm proud of the fact that, unlike my opponents, people have actually paid to hear me speak. In actuality, at the close of my campaign, my accounts will be in the black and my campaign costs fully covered. Those attending my speeches, expecting to hear only about women's suffrage, have been disappointed, as I spoke about the many issues facing our country, including tariffs, free trade, and temperance. My running mate, Marietta Stowe, you may know as the publisher of the Women's Herald and a founder of the Equal Rights Party. Together, our many supporters are managing to get our ballot into several states. And here is one right now. You may think that I have the support of all of my fellow suffragists, but sadly that is not the case. I mourn the erosion of my relationship with those such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They and others see me as too radical and fear that my candidacy will harm the suffrage movement, opening it to ridicule. They support other candidates in the belief that these other candidates will take up the suffrage cause. I do not think that their faith is warranted. I am not content to simply aspire to equality, asking those in power to grant it. I believe that in running for president, I am reaching out and grasping that equality to which women are entitled. While I am ever hopeful, I do not know if I will win the presidential bid. Maybe at best I will get a few thousand votes. But I am showing that a woman can run. Do I believe that a time will come when a woman will assume our nation's highest office? If a woman demonstrates that she is fitted to be president, she will someday occupy the White House. It will be entirely on her own merit. No movement can place her there simply because she is a woman. She must prove herself fit for the position. In closing, I return to the words of Abigail Adams, written over 100 years ago, yet still relevant today. While her husband John was attending the Continental Congress, Abigail wrote to him saying, "If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." I believe that day has come. As to my own future, I don't claim to be clairvoyant, but I expect to be continuing to practice law well into my old age, working on behalf of the United Peace Union, trying to bring about world peace and arbitration, representing Indians' rights, and continuing to be an active political and social figure well into my old age. Who knows? Perhaps I will even run again in 1888 if I am not successful this time. And while it's likely that I will not live quite long enough to see women win the right to vote, I think that it cannot be too far off if we collectively continue to fight for the right so poignantly reflected in this ballad. I have a neighbor, one of those not very hard to find, who know it all without debate and never change their mind. I asked him what of woman's rights, he said in tones severe, "My mind on that is all made up. Keep woman in her sphere." I saw a man in tattered garb forth from the grog shop come. He squandered all his cash for drink and starved his wife at home. I asked him, should not woman vote? He answered with a sneer, "I've taught my wife to know her place, keep woman in her sphere." I met an earnest, thoughtful man not many days ago, who pondered deep all human law, the honest truth to know. I asked him what of woman's cause, the answer came sincere, Her rights are just the same as mine. Let woman choose her sphere. And so I am asking you to help me attain my chosen sphere so that I may strive on your behalf to achieve equality and justice for all citizens. Belva Lockwood for president. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lockwood, for joining us tonight, and good luck with your quest.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for me on policy or something else?
Well, you have a vote of a male. Scott Wayne says you have my vote.
Excellent, excellent. Only a few thousand more. Ah, and we have another one. Well, thank you very much.
I think you answered all our questions. Would you all give a round of applause to Ann Barrett? Ann, thank you for joining us, and Belva, good luck.
Thank you.
Good night,
Vote Belva
everybody.
Lockwood.